Hi, everyone. Welcome to Kindred Skulls. I'm Matt Freese, and I'm back with another episode. It's been a little while since I've recorded, but it was kind of the dog days of summer for the NFL. There wasn't a lot going on. There was maybe one or two small news items here, but nothing really that I felt warranted a full episode that came in after I did all of my pieces on the Vikings draft picks, right? And you can certainly go back and listen to all those, listen to everything else I've done. I've done a lot of work on the Vikings free agents that came in and that sort of stuff over the course of the summer. But the Vikings are finally back at training camp, which means that we get to, I see clips. I mean, I'm not in Minnesota, right? So I can only really see it through clips, but the excitement of football being back is definitely here, right? We're getting reports on who's playing with the first team, who's, how JJ McCarthy looks, right? That's what everybody wants to know. All sorts of stuff coming from training camp. We're gearing up to play preseason games. There'll actually be real tape for me to break down when the preseason games happen. Obviously, probably most of the players playing in those aren't going to be significantly impactful on the team, but I hope we get at least a couple drives from JJ McCarthy in the first preseason game and that sort of thing. So the concept I had for the episode today was just go through some questions I have about the Vikings and what I expect the answers to be, or maybe what I'm looking for, but still recognizing that they're kind of open questions that we need to find out the answers to, and I don't know the answers to either. So I kind of thought it'd be fun to give my takes on these situations while recognizing that also I don't know, what the final result is going to be, right? Nobody here has a window into the future in terms of predicting what we're going to be able to see. So for me, these are the 5 burning questions I have about the Vikings, and we'll get into each of them. The first one is the most obvious. It's, what are we going to get from JJ McCarthy? The second is kind of a buzzy thing that was happening during the minicamp OTA cycle in terms of what is Dallas Turner's role going to be on this team. The third one is, what are the Vikings going to do with the cornerback position, which we're getting some answers from camp, but, or maybe the DB room at large, right, is the second part of that. The third one for me is with all of the new pieces, the fourth one for me with all the new pieces on the offensive line. How is that going to look as we move into the season? And then the fifth one is a little bit of a more interesting question I have is, what are the Vikings going to get from the depth of their roster? And I'm not talking about like the 2D where you have like the immediate backups with like Jordan Mason, right, directly backing up Aaron Jones, or like Blake Brandel being a swing interior offensive lineman. But I'm talking about the deeper, let's say players 40 through 53 on the roster. What kind of, what do I think of those players? And then what might we be able to expect from them, as we get into the season? I'm not trying to say anybody that is going to have a significant impact, but I kind of wanted to examine those players and see if there's anybody that pops out to me as somebody who might be interesting moving forward. And obviously camp may reveal somebody who I don't even have in mind right now, who might be able to make an impact on this roster. Just like somebody like Taki Taimani last year, right? I had no expectations for heading into training camp, and he played pretty good in the preseason, and he played at least a couple snaps during the regular season, right? So I'm not talking like a major impact from a player, but it'd be nice to see somebody step up and give me a high opinion of them, like I have of Taki Taimani, for example, or Jalen Redmond, and both same position group, but you get the idea. So let's go back to the JJ McCarthy question, right? And this is the number one question looming over the Minnesota Vikings. If you listen to any NFL-wide preview content, they're all questioning what JJ McCarthy is going to be able to do as the Vikings quarterback, all trying to see if he's going to be a player who can step in right away and have an immediate impact. You have mixed opinions. Usually a little bit on the negative side, I would say, from the national media of whether or not he's going to be able to do that right away, right? And I think it's fair, certainly, to take someone who has never had NFL experience, and never had, and was injured all of last year, right? He got, I guess, a lot of the preseason work, but he really didn't get a ton of training camp. He didn't, finish all the way training camp. He only played in one preseason game. He didn't have the week in and week out practice throughout the season with the team, right? He was rehabbing during all of that process, so he couldn't play the game in the way that you might need to grow as a quarterback. I think it's fair to have questions about that. But what I wanted to do is I can't control any of JJ McCarthy's preparation, right? That's up to JJ McCarthy and Kevin O'Connell and the Vikings staff to get him right. What I can do is look back at the tape of what we've seen JJ McCarthy do on the football field, whether that's in Michigan or in the one preseason game he was able to play last year, and try to predict, keeping what Sam Darnold did in mind last year, what JJ McCarthy is going to look like in the Vikings offense. So I went back to the tape a little bit, certainly leaned heavily on the notes that I had from charting all 15 games of JJ McCarthy in 2023 at Michigan. And then I also went back to, I watched all the plays. It's like 18, 19 plays from the preseason game that he had to try to get an idea of, or to try to refresh myself, right? Because I kind of had this information in mind last year of who JJ McCarthy is as a player and what that might mean for the Vikings. So I'm going to go through a little bit of the scouting stuff right now and try to come to an idea of how I think that'll match up once he sees the football field. The first thing I saw from McCarthy in the game is that, or at Michigan and in the preseason game, is that he's comfortable with a variety of dropbacks, right? Michigan asked him to be under center. They didn't ask him to be under center as much as the Vikings are going to ask him to be under center, but he did have to execute play action dropbacks from under center at the University of Michigan. And I thought his footwork was very clean and consistent in terms of where he was dropping back in terms of drop back depth. Like, he was hitting the landmarks that I felt he was supposed to based on the play design. So that's a really positive note for a young player to me, because if you have a player who has played the entire time in college in a spread offense where he's in shotgun the whole time, often taking just a one-step drop back and throwing the ball on an RPO, or taking a three-step drop back, right, and releasing the ball at the top of his drop, they're not going to be as nuanced with that drop back footwork. It can hurt the offensive line if you're not dropping back to the right depth. It can be a struggle for the timing of the offense. Because McCarthy was able to play in a timing-based offense at Michigan, right, one that ran a lot more like an NFL offense than a lot of what you see in college, I think it'll really help McCarthy transition to the NFL in Kevin O'Connell's offense, which is a very timing, drop-back based system, right? Routes come open at certain times. You need to have your feet tied to your progressions as you're going through them, and I think McCarthy does a good job of that, or did a good job of that at Michigan. Having that combination, I think, will help prevent his head from spinning when he first gets on the field in the NFL, right? And obviously, I say first gets on the field, I mean playing regular season action against real defenses. Playing against the Raiders 2s last year, right? The Raiders were one of the worst teams in the NFL, even if we expected them to have a good defense going in to the season, is not really going to be as indicative as what it'll look like week one when he hits the field against the Chicago Bears. So I thought that just the drop back footwork was a really good thing for McCarthy. And then I also thought his pocket management was really good. He's good at making micro movements in the pocket to be able to sidestep pressure, to be able to extend plays. And then when he needs to break the pocket, when he needs to scramble outside, he also has the athleticism to be able to do that, right? So I do want to say that I don't know if it's going to be all that different from Sam Darnold. I thought Sam Darnold actually did a really good job of pocket management last year. There were certainly struggles towards maybe the last couple games of the season, but a lot of the pressure that Sam Darnold faced, even if it was in part due to him holding onto the ball, right? The offensive line needed to pass protect for a long time. He was holding onto the ball because he was progressing through the Vikings offense, and the Vikings offense, because they want to attack so far deep, is a little bit of a slower developing offense than other teams have. So I really thought Sam Darnold actually did a pretty good job with pocket management last year. I'm hoping that JJ McCarthy can also live up to that level. And Sam Darnold was under pressure a ton, right? So it's part of it is that, McCarthy may still be facing a ton of pressure just because of the time to throw that the Vikings had, right? Sam Darnold had like the third longest time to throw But based on the PFF data, and I didn't chart every pressure, right? So I'm just trusting them for some small information here, whether they can, we might disagree on what a pressure is or whatever, but I think the overall data is hopefully points you in the right direction, right? Sam Darnold was only responsible for about 10% of the pressures that he faced. That's in like the bottom 10 of quarterbacks. A lot of quarterbacks are responsible for more like 15 or 20% of the pressures that they face, just based on holding the ball too long or maybe running into pressure if they try to bail from the pocket, right? Someone like Caleb Williams is going to be a lot more responsible for his own pressure than someone like Sam Darnold is. So I think JJ McCarthy, who also had a similar rate of causing his own pressures, I think it was 10 or 11% as well at Michigan, will be able to step into what Sam Darnold was doing and not be the culprit for those pressures. Hopefully that staying, not very responsible for his own pressures with hopefully, and I'll get to it later, improved offensive line means really good things to me for the Vikings offense. Now, I still expect the Vikings offense to have maybe a little bit higher pressure rate than normal just because they want the quarterback to hold on to the ball for a little bit longer to open up routes with multiple moves that are deeper down the field. But I think that McCarthy has shown the ability on tape to manage that very effectively. So I'm really hopeful that he's not killed by pressure in his first season as quarterback. So, and that kind of ties into a little bit of the differences that McCarthy will see. I think he's going to be attacking a lot deeper down the field. He did attack intermediate over the middle of the field a lot at Michigan, but I think the depth of those targets is going to be deeper. The Vikings don't run a ton of quick game stuff. I know it's been kind of a debate over the past few years if the Vikings should really run more quick game. When Darisaw went out, it's like, okay, should the Vikings go to more quick game, the short drops? But it's not something that Kevin O'Connell wants to do all that often, and it's led to a really, really explosive offense for the Vikings, right? The kind of the lack of quick game, I think, has helped with the explosive nature of the Vikings offense because they were just constantly attacking deep time after time after time. But it's a little bit different from what JJ McCarthy did in Michigan to that regard, right? He's not going to have as many 1 and 3 step drops, which is just kind of the nature of college football, right? Because if you're Michigan and you're playing East Carolina, right? A lot of times you can 1-step drop, get the ball to Roman Wilson in space, and he's going to crush everybody else on the field. Even though Roman Wilson isn't really a quality receiver in the NFL, right? He dealt with injury issues last year, but I didn't really see him as a top-tier prospect. He's going to dominate the lower levels of competition at the college game because he's still a good enough player. That's not exactly the case in the NFL, where everybody is relatively on the same level in terms of their athleticism, right? There's not as much of a gap between college. So McCarthy probably doesn't have the easy dump off stuff. And I'm not saying he had a ton of that at Michigan, but there's RPO stuff, there's quick game stuff that I don't know if he's going to be able to access. So it'll be a little bit of a transition for him attacking further downfield. The other thing I think might be an issue is that in college, McCarthy really didn't let plays die. I only charted, I believe, 2 throwaways over the course of his entire 2023 season at Michigan. By contrast, Sam Darnold had 39 throwaways in the Vikings offense last year, right? So Darnold, who was pretty efficient overall, I know we have a bad memory of Sam Darnold because of the final 2 games he played as a Viking, and I don't think he was necessarily a player I would have wanted to invest in long-term because of his flaws, but in general, Sam Darnold led a very efficient offense and played very good quarterback last year, right? It wasn't elite quarterback play, but it was very good quarterback play. So I would hope that if the Vikings can get something similar to McCarthy, I would say we should be hoping the Vikings can get something similar from JJ McCarthy to what they got from Sam Darnold last year, right? It wouldn't be a bad thing if he has a similar year from Darnold, and it would be a very good thing if he outpaced Darnold. But one of the things that might be a pitfall for McCarthy is that he really held onto the ball a long time in college. Or I shouldn't say a long time, but he didn't give up on plays in college, right? He didn't end up throwing the ball away. He would scramble and always try to find a target downfield. And that's generally an admirable trait. It worked out extremely well for him, right? He was a pretty efficient passer at Michigan. He didn't throw a lot of interceptions. I think he only threw 4 interceptions or whatever it was at Michigan in 2023. And he only had 9 interceptable passes by my count after watching all of the data, right? Or charting all of the data. But when he only has, a couple throwaways and a couple of the interceptable passes are because he didn't let the play die and he tried to fit the ball into a window, you can see how that got exacerbated against better defenses in the NFL or better talent that he's playing comparatively, right? There are going to be more plays that are set up for failure just because the defense covers it well, and you're going to need to throw the ball away, right? And again, it's not like McCarthy was taking too many sacks. I think he only had like 16 sacks or something like that, or he was throwing a bunch of interceptable passes because he wouldn't want the play die. It said he never had to let the play die because he and his teammates had more talent than the people that they were playing against. And again, I'm not like trying to say Michigan had a fantastic offensive talent. Like, I don't think their offensive line was a very good pass blocking line. I don't think their receivers outside of Colson Loveland were really NFL caliber players, right? And Colson Loveland's a tight end. Obviously, he went top 10. I think he was pretty solid for a receiving tight end with good after catch potential. But like, he also wasn't a world beating target, right? Who it was impossible to match up against for defenses. So at the end of the day, like, even though Michigan didn't have the best talent in the world, it's still way better than most of the teams that they were playing. And McCarthy was able to overcome that against teams that did have really good talent, like Alabama or Ohio State or something like that, right? So he should be credited for that, but we should also recognize that he didn't give up on plays. And if he continues to not give up on plays at the NFL level, he might have a lot more sacks or he might have a lot more interceptable passes. So it's something I'm watching out for as he starts out the season for the Vikings. The other, I would say, blemish with his game from a mental perspective, right? Holding onto the ball a little bit too long in some cases. And then there were times where it looked like he had open receivers who were part of the progression where he turned those throws down, right? I call them turn downs. You have receiver number 1 in your progression is open. You decide not to throw the ball for some reason. Now, there may be a valid reason. He usually made good on it, right? Especially on 3rd and long plays where he's like one of the most efficient players in the country. But when you have an initial option, I'd like to see you throw that ball rather than necessarily transitioning to becoming a playmaker, right? And this kind of ties into holding on the ball too long. Maybe he has a little bit too much playmaker in him that we would want to rein in a little bit. And obviously, some of the best quarterbacks in the NFL, or all of the best quarterbacks in the NFL, are playmakers, right? They are guys who are able to extend plays. There are guys who are able to go off script and be successful, right? That's probably what you think of when you think of Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, or Lamar Jackson, are those off script plays. But I think an underrated component of playing quarterback is being able to constantly play on script. And Patrick Mahomes in particular has done this, as that offensive has evolved. Just play on script as often as you can and only use that playmaking ability as a last resort. Somebody who doesn't play on script often enough is Caleb Williams, right? He's constantly, and he was not comfortable in that Bears offense at all last year, but he was constantly trying to go to his playmaking ability, and that makes it really hard to play quarterback well. That's why he ended up taking so many sacks. So my hope is that with the incredible weapons and the incredible offensive line that JJ McCarthy has around him and the mental experience he's gained, he's able to reel in that playmaker gene a little bit, right? He's able to reel in the desire to be a scrambler and go make plays, which I don't think is like a major issue with this game, but I'm trying to find, who he's going to be this year. And I think we may have some plays he wants back because he had an open option initially and decided not to throw the ball. The next point I have on McCarthy is that I have no questions about his arm talent. I mean, I have some questions about his accuracy, right? He had issues both throwing deep and to the left in college. There are mechanical reasons for that. Luke Braun, who does Locked On NFL, also has a Patreon. He's been on this show. he has dug way, way deeper than I have into the mechanics of quarterbacking and into JJ McCarthy's mechanics specifically, and trying to see what changes that McCarthy has made, since he joined the Vikings from what he was doing in college. I'm not going that quite deep in the mechanical things and what that might mean for how accurate JJ McCarthy is as a player. What I want to say here is that I'm watching for how JJ McCarthy does in terms of accuracy, right? As he transitions to the NFL level. He had issues at specific areas of the field. I'm really interested to see if he's been able to resolve those issues over the course of the last year, right? And obviously it's hard. He probably hasn't been able to work as much as he wanted to due to the injury. For what you expect for progression from the first year to the second year, but he still has had time to rebuild that throwing motion and kind of make changes and hopefully improve his accuracy. So I'm really interested to see how that works. But in terms of his ability to make the throws, I mean, I think you've heard all of the reports coming out of training camp and OTAs and stuff like that, where he clearly has the arm to make all the throws. And I thought any narrative that he was kind of a game manager at Michigan just because of how good their run game was completely off base. So I just wanted to bring that back again. And then the final point I have is that I would be really interested to see the Vikings do more with JJ McCarthy in the run game. I'm not exactly sold that they're going to. I was going back and looking at, and I don't have exact counts for this, right? But at some of the data that PFF has, Sam Darnold had like one or two designed runs, and I'm pretty sure I can picture them as QB draws, that weren't scrambles, that weren't scrambles, weren't kneel downs, or weren't QB sneaks, right? Last year. And Sam Darnold's a pretty decent athlete. It's the Vikings didn't really have interest in developing a quarterback run game. They also honestly didn't do a ton of QB runs with Josh Dobbs, right? Josh Dobbs scrambled a ton, and I'm hoping I was doing the PFF data right, but it really looked like in terms of designed runs that Josh Dobbs had, he only had like 3 in the Denver game, right? Which is a game I think of as a lot of running happening from the quarterback position, but he only had like a handful of designed quarterback runs over the 5 or 6 starts that he had, right? 1 or 2 a game, which granted, you probably don't want your quarterback getting 10, 15 carries a game, right? That's way too high, but having a couple that you sprinkle in for JJ McCarthy, who I think is a really good athlete. Like he's not, okay, I shouldn't say really good athlete. I think JJ McCarthy is a quality athlete for the quarterback position in the NFL, which I think we underrate a little bit how much quarterbacks are athletes these days in the general scheme of things. Obviously, we have incredible athletes like Jaden Daniels and Lamar Jackson at quarterbacks. We have Josh Allen's an incredible runner and athlete as a quarterback, right? But I think McCarthy can add value in the quarterback run game. He did quarterback run game at Michigan, right? He did some GT. I think he ran a GT counter play or two. He did obviously the traditional read option. The designed runs were about half of his, I believe, 40 total regular runs. He ran like 20 something designed runs and 20 something scrambles, which accounted for his rushing attempts in college. So I do think the Vikings can have something there. I just don't expect them to really run that. But I think his athleticism as a scrambler will be beneficial in the same way that Sam Darnold's athleticism as a scrambler was beneficial for the Vikings. So in terms of a comparison to Darnold, right, I think McCarthy can make the throws that Darnold can. Darnold probably has a little bit better pure arm talent. And I think of, that deep ball to Justin Jefferson on the post. That was the 98-yard touchdown against the 49ers. Do I think McCarthy can make that throw? Maybe not quite as easily as I think Sam Darnold can, but it's pretty close. In terms of having velocity to things like the honey hole against cover 2, right? The John Gruden turkey hole, whatever you want to call it. Making a up and down throw. I remember seeing one from camp to TJ Hawkinson, right, on those dig routes that kind of need to get up and down under the player, ripping a ball up the seam to like Jalen Naylor, which was also a play that Darnold had in the 49ers game, right? The one that kind of sealed the game for them. I think McCarthy is really going to be able to kind of make all of those throws if asked to. He may not have, there may be one or two throws Darnold made last year that McCarthy doesn't have in his bag, but I think they have really similar arm talent in terms of the velocity and, the distance they're able to throw the football. So I think you have similar athletic ability, similar arm talent. It comes down to the mental side of the game. And if McCarthy is able to remain more calm under pressure than Darnold at the end of the year, if you're able to see more consistency from McCarthy on going through the reads and making those reads, you could even see better play from him than what you got from Sam Darnold last year, even if I think Darnold played pretty good. So I do think there's upside with McCarthy compared to Darnold. I would hope that he's able to play on Sam Darnold's level, honestly. And again, I'm saying it's a pretty high level. Like, that's a top half of the league quarterback, let's say, in any given year, right? So, I definitely think if you take all of the quarterbacks last year, Sam Darnold was in the top 16 in terms of his overall performance over the course of the year. I truly think JJ McCarthy can reach that level this year. I'm not necessarily expecting him to, right? It's his first year. I think we may see more blunders from McCarthy than what we saw from Darnold, but Darnold wasn't without his share of mistakes, right? So I'm just really hoping the Vikings are able to continue to push the ball vertically. The Vikings will probably push the ball vertically a little bit less than Sam Darnold did, right? Darnold was by nature an extremely aggressive quarterback, but I still think that we're going to see a ton of digs to Justin Jefferson over the middle of the field. We're not going to miss out on those. Maybe we'll see one or two less Jordan Addison deep balls, suspension notwithstanding, right? But in all, I think we're going to get a pretty similar style of quarterback play for McCarthy than what we did to Darnold. Maybe he gets rid of the ball a little bit quicker. Maybe he's a little bit more willing to check down. Maybe there's a little bit more quick game, but I think it's going to be pretty similar, and I'm really hopeful that we're going to get similar results. So that was a long ramble on what JJ McCarthy might be for the Vikings, but hopefully it added a little bit of clarity and kind of recentered us for our expectations and kind of allowed us to remember who he is as a player a little bit. The next player I want to talk about is Dallas Turner, right? And there's been a lot of buzz on Turner's role within the Vikings defense. Obviously, the Vikings have Jonathan Grenard and Andrew Van Ginkel as two premier edges. Both were Pro Bowlers. Van Ginkel was a second-team All-Pro. Probably should have gone to Grenard instead of Van Ginkel, but you know what I mean. So you want both of those guys on the field very, very often. Where does that leave Dallas Turner? Obviously, the Vikings made a high investment in Dallas Turner. Even if you don't want to add up all the draft capital they technically traded to get to the 17th spot, taking a guy 17th overall is a really high investment. You expect that kind of first-round pick to pan out for you. You also have an example of Jared Verse, right, who hit the ground running right away, was a really impressive edge rusher for the Rams, won Defensive Rookie of the Year, taking like 2 picks after Turner. So you have a quote-unquote same position guy who, it feels like from a Vikings fan perspective, the pressure is really on Dallas Turner this year to kind of show out and show something, right? And if he doesn't, that's a cause for concern, even if he has 2 quality players in front of him. So that obviously leads to speculation. Well, we want to keep Grenard and Van Ginkel on the field. Where does that leave Dallas Turner? And people like Brian Flores have called Dallas Turner a quote-unquote third starter along that defensive line room. So are they going to play them all at the same time? Or are there going to be packages where Dallas Turner's an off-ball linebacker? Like, what does that mean? I don't think that the Vikings necessarily plan to play Dallas Turner at off-ball linebacker consistently. He only played a couple snaps of that last year. Andrew Van Ginkel played a little bit more, but, that was pretty much as a pure injury fill-in when Cashman or Pace were injured. I just don't see it becoming a more expanded part of the Vikings defense. Obviously, Dallas Turner will drop into more coverage more often than your traditional edge rusher. He and Van Ginkel both do. I don't expect them to stop dropping into coverage more often, but I also don't expect like a position switch for Dallas Turner, right? I would expect Dallas Turner's role, and by role, I mean 500 to 600 snaps of playing on the edge. That, to me, is a third starter at edge, right? That's 50 to 60% of the snaps as an edge rusher for Dallas Turner. And when I say as an edge rusher, I guess we can include third down snaps, right? Where you have, last year you had the 4 quote unquote edge rusher package with Ward, Turner, Van Ginkel, Grenard on the field, or sometimes Pat Jones replaced one of those 3, right? But there will be plenty of snaps where it's a passing down and the Vikings have all 3 of Van Ginkel, Grenard, and Turner rushing the passer, right? On the line of scrimmage and rushing the passer. Who is reduced down inside, who is, technically on the edge of those plays, doesn't really matter to me. I consider those edge rusher plays for those players, right? Their job is to get after the passer in that case. But, for Turner specifically, I think when you look at the Vikings base packages, they played a total of 2,600 edge rusher snaps last year. Or I should say, edge rushers played a total of 2,600 snaps for the Vikings last year. So obviously that means situations where 3 players, Van Ginkel, Grenard, and Jones or Turner, were on the field at once. That means mostly situations where 2 edge rushers were on the field at once. But those 4 players combined for 1,600 snaps. To me, the Vikings played Van Ginkel and Grenard a little bit more than I would like them to. Both played over 900 snaps. Van Ginkel played 922. Grenard played 919. That's about 80% of the snaps, which isn't uncommon for edge rushers in the league, but I would say a more common number is somewhere between 70 and 80% of the snaps, leaning more down towards the 70% range, and more 70 to 75%. So Danielle Hunter also played a ton of snaps. I think he actually played over 1,000 snaps for the Vikings in 2023. For the Texans last year, he played about 70% of the snaps, which was somewhere in the 750 to 800 snap range. I would hope that the Vikings, seeing progression from Dallas Turner, right? And there's been a lot of positive camp reports about him. He looks bigger, he looks more explosive, or they talk about how he has been more explosive through camp, which is pretty impressive if you watched him at all last year. Like his explosion or his first step quickness was really impressive. Now, if they mean explosiveness by being able to run through people, that is something he needed to improve on, I would say. So certainly would be a positive there. But if we bring Van Ginkel and Grenard down to something like 800 snaps or 750 snaps, right? That would really leave room for Turner to get on the field a lot more often. I said there were 2,600 snaps for the Vikings edge room last year. If we put both Van Ginkel and Grenard at 75% of the snaps, that's about 850 snaps each. So you multiply that by 2, obviously that's 1,700 snaps. You subtract 2,600, that from 2,600, you get 900 snaps left over. So that's the pool that Dallas Turner has to work with. 900 snaps is more than what I'm projecting Grenard and Van Ginkel to have. Obviously, the Vikings will get some snaps from their depth at the edge room, whether that's Gabriel Murphy, Bo Richter, Tyler Batty, Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins playing some edge as kind of a more base kind of player. However that winds out, I expect those guys to play snaps too, but I really think Dallas Turner can take up 600 of those snaps, right? He could take up 2/3 of those snaps. And some of that will be with all 3 edges on the field at the same time. But I really think you can have a heavy rotation where you put, say, Dallas Turner and Jonathan Grenard on the field at the same time, or you put Andrew Van Ginkel and Dallas Turner on the field at the same time. And you can have that switch where you give one guy a little bit of a break. You still have a lot of firepower off the edge. I don't think it'll be a rotation where you put on the second team for a couple drives a half, Dallas Turner and Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins. I'm sure you'll have situations where they're both on the field, or whoever the 4th edge rusher shakes out to be. But I really think you can keep a heavy rotation of Dallas Turner in to keep Andrew Van Ginkel and Jonathan Grenard a little bit more fresh. And you don't have to create weird roles that primarily don't exist in the NFL and are things I would not want Dallas Turner doing as often, like in coverage. Like I think it's critical to note that Dallas Turner is a really good coverage player. And by the end of last year, I think he was a really good coverage player for an edge rusher. He's still not as good of a coverage player as a linebacker, right? So I wouldn't want him to be on the field and have a primarily linebacker role. That just doesn't provide a ton of value to the Vikings to me. What I would want is to have him as a threat at the line of scrimmage, dropping off. And you could do that with 3 linebacker sets, right? But I think if you do it too often with all 3 players on the field at the same time in base down situations, you really run the risk of getting exploited because you have a guy who's not quite as good in coverage as a traditional linebacker. Now, he may be, somewhat equal in coverage to what Ivan Pace is, but that's still kind of a weakness that the Vikings need to address on their roster, right? Is having a second really good coverage, hook zone player next to Blake Cashman. So overall, I don't expect Dallas Turner's role to change much from what we expect from Andrew Van Ginkel, right? I expect them to have very similar roles. That does mean playing in coverage more often than a traditional edge rusher, than pretty much 31 other teams ask their edge rusher to play in coverage. But it doesn't mean a transition to like this new position, or people have theorized it's I think I saw, maybe it was a Kevin Seifert article that said like a Josh Metellus like role. I don't really see that from Dallas Turner. I see him as primarily a player who rushes the passer and plays the run on the line of scrimmage, which I think is totally fine. And I think there's a lot to be really excited about with what Dallas Turner was able to do at the end of last year. He stood out as like becoming very violent to me in how he rushed. And that's what I like to see from players, right? He's trying to throw other people. He's trying to throw the opposing offensive lineman around in the backfield. He could shy away from contact, especially in the run game early in the season. As the season went on, I think he gained more confidence and maybe a little bit more strength throughout the course of the season, and was able to compress run lanes and kind of make positive plays against the run that I didn't really see early on. So I definitely think he needs to continue that momentum, right? He needed to have gotten stronger over the offseason and also retain the explosiveness and the speed rush potential he had, right? And the bend that he had. The one sack, I think it was against the Bears, against Darnell Wright, was a really nice showcase of bend and his ability to turn the corner at the top of the drop. He needs to keep that and develop inside moves and inside counters from his pass rush game. So I'm really hopeful that he was able to do that over the course of the offseason, and we'll kind of see where he's landed with the Vikings. But again, I don't expect him to have some weird, the Brian Flores' defense is unique, right? But I don't expect him to have some completely unheard of role where he's kind of this, I don't know, a mixed player who straddles lines between linebacker and edge rusher any more than Andrew Van Ginkel already does, or what Dallas Turner did last year already did, right? I don't expect a massive expansion of that role. I expect more snaps in the role he's already been playing. So that brings me to my third question. My third main question is that what are the Vikings doing in the defensive back room? And this is primarily a cornerback, but I guess I'll go to the safety room first, right? The Vikings, over the past 2 years under Brian Flores, have played all 3 safeties 90+% of snaps. Actually, if I pull it up here, that's technically not correct. Harrison Smith played 89% of the snaps last year, and Josh Metellus played 87% of the snaps last year. They were the 3rd and 4th highest snap count on the Vikings defense, right? They each played 90+% of the snaps. Obviously, Cam Bynum played over 90% of the snaps. They each played 94+% of the snaps 2 years ago. Those guys were on the field all the time. Now Cam Bynum's gone. Are the Vikings going to change how they play defense, right? We don't have necessarily a high opinion of Theo Jackson, or we don't know a lot of information about Theo Jackson. I would say that no, I expect the Vikings to put Theo Jackson on the field now for 90+% of the snaps, just like Cam Bynum was. Cam Bynum played 1,032 snaps last year. I expect Theo Jackson to hit 1,000 snaps. part of that is the Vikings don't have a third cornerback that I trust, right? And the Vikings base out of their dime package with Josh Metellus is primarily a slot defender, which is how you could have projected Josh Metellus to make something in the range of his $36 million a year contract. Tyler Forness actually did a slightly better job than me. I had him making $13.5 million a year. Tyler had him at slightly under 12, and obviously he got $12 million a year. But I based that 13.5 number off of Kyler Gordon's contract, right? I thought it was going to be an improvement on Kyler Gordon's contract ultimately. There were a couple other guys like Kyle Duggar, that sort of thing. And it was kind of in that range of the top 10 linebacker contracts and top 10 safety contracts. So it wasn't like completely off base for where Metellus kind of sits as players. But like to me, it was pretty clear that he should be among the slot defenders or, the fringe top 10 at the linebacker slash safety position, right? Which are paid roughly the same. So it doesn't really matter what you classify him at. So that was a long rant for no apparent reason. I expect Josh Metellus to continue to play roughly 90% of the snaps. I expect Harrison Smith, even at his old age, to continue to play roughly 90% of the snaps. And I expect Theo Jackson to basically just take over the Cam Bynum role pretty much 1-to-1. There was a ton of hype about Theo Jackson, last year's camp. I think he really stood out early on as somebody who got a lot of love from the beat. He didn't get to play a lot last year because the Vikings were really healthy in the safety room once again. So an injury to Metellus or Harrison Smith, right, and knock on wood, right, they've been extremely healthy the last couple of years, could change the overall complexion of how the Vikings run the defense. But from before the season, I don't expect it to change. I expect Theo Jackson to slot right in and play 90+% of the snaps. The Vikings have a ton of confidence in Theo Jackson. It's kind of interesting because if I listen to Vikings specific things, nobody's really questioning Theo Jackson's stepping in, right? And we're a little bit more familiar with the day-to-day for the Vikings. So we kind of have the background of this is somebody that the staff really hyped up last year. It's pretty much just they had 3 starting safeties who were playing all at a very high level that they couldn't even find room for Theo Jackson on the field, right? Like it's rare to play 3 safeties at a time in the NFL. The Vikings are like one of the only teams that does that anyway. So it's rare to even have more than 2 safeties on the field. So of course, a guy who's the 4th behind 3 really good players is going to get pushed to the side and not play a ton of snaps. But I think the Vikings have been grooming him for this role. I think that's why they were willing to let Cam Bynum walk in free agency. And I think they expect to play him that number of snaps. I think that might be a little bit surprising to people on the outside, right, who aren't as plugged in. And I've heard people on more national podcasts mention that they're really uncertain about Theo Jackson. And I think it's fair to be uncertain. Like, I can't tell you if Theo Jackson's going to be good. But in this case, I honestly really trust the Vikings defense to have evaluated what they've seen in Theo Jackson, right? They did it with Josh Metellus. They found the role for him and they evaluated it and worked really, really well. They did it for Cam Bynum, who had an abysmal year with Ed Donatel. Like he was really, really bad that year and then played fantastic in the Vikings defense. They identified that skill set and were able to fit him in a role or put him in a role that fit him. And I think they're going to be able to do the same thing with Theo Jackson here. And I think they wouldn't have let Cam Bynum move on if they didn't believe that. So I feel pretty strongly that Theo Jackson is going to have a good year and he's going to be a quality player, which means that I expect the Vikings to be running 3 safety sets pretty much all the time, right? They're going to be playing, in mostly a base nickel defense, and that could be 5 down linemen, right? You have the 3 defensive tackles, 2 edge rushers, a single linebacker and Blake Cashman, the 3 safeties, and 2 corners. That could be, you take one of the interior defensive linemen off the field, you typically have 5 DBs on the field and 3 safeties with just 2 corners. The Vikings played a bunch of dime last year where they ended up putting Shaq Griffin on the field as their 3rd player in those passing situations. I fully expect that to be the case, right? Kind of a 4-1-6. So those, to me, it's going to be very rare for the Vikings to run a 5-2-1, right? That would technically, or a 5-2-4. That would technically be their base personnel, also known as a 3-4. I'm just counting our quote-unquote outside linebackers as defensive linemen, because that's what they are. They rush the passer, right? I think they're going to run a lot of 5-1-5. That's 5 defensive linemen, 1 linebacker. Counting again the outside linebackers as defensive linemen. I think they're going to run a lot of 4-1-5. I think they're going to run a decent amount of 4-2-5, where you take an interior defensive lineman off the field. But in pretty much all of those circumstances, they're going to have 3 safeties on the field. And even when they only have 4 defensive backs, I think they might be more likely to take an Isaiah Rodgers off the field and play with 1 corner, Byron Murphy, out on the field, which they did in a fair number of snaps last year, than they are to take that 3rd safety off the field. I think it might be an equal kind of proportion in those situations, which are pretty rare for them to run, but they really happen on kind of run-focused downs and run-focused situations. So, I expect all 3 of those guys to play a ton of snaps this year. I would bet on them, all 3 of them being in the top 5 snap getters for the Vikings on defense, barring injury. But, moving from my confidence in Theo Jackson, I kind of want to bring up my lack of confidence in the Vikings cornerback room. I really like Byron Murphy. I think he's a quality starter. I don't think he's like a top 10 corner in the NFL at all, but I think he can match up okay against number 1 receivers, is really, really good against number 2 receivers, and can be the lead cornerback in your CB room. So the high praise for him there. I like the idea of Isaiah Rodgers. I thought he was a very feisty player. I thought he's got clear athletic ability. I think he's got great movement skills for the position. But by athletic ability, I meant recovery speed. Like, he's like really, really fast. I think he's got pretty solid ball skills for the position. I question whether that'll translate to a full-time role. I'm willing to give the Vikings the benefit of the doubt that it will translate to a more full-time role, something like 700-800 snaps, similar to what Stephon Gilmore got last year, is what I would expect for a player like Isaiah Rodgers, where Byron Murphy is like, basically 100% of the snaps, unless he's injured or maybe out on a couple of very specific situations. Really needs a breather for some reason, right? But where I really start to question is the Vikings' 3rd corner. And that's only amplified as camp started, and it appears that Jeff Okudah is like locked in with the number 1s. So there was a little bit of, I don't know if it's conflicting reporting, but it was just, maybe I saw people misunderstanding what the reporting is, right? I saw something about Mekhi Blackmon starting to mix in with the 1s. And the reality is, based on all the tweets that I've seen and the kind of the reporting I've seen, is that the 1s in that scenario were Byron Murphy, Jeff Okudah, and Mekhi Blackmon, because Isaiah Rodgers was on the sideline dealing with a minor injury of some sort, right? The 1s primarily have been Murphy, Rodgers, and Okudah's never mixed in with the 2s, right? So Mekhi Blackmon is firmly with the 2s. And I think there's a couple of really interesting things about that, right? So I would have expected, point blank, Mekhi Blackmon to have the initial advantage over Jeff Okudah as we headed into training camp. I realized that Okudah has a little bit more experience in the NFL, but Blackmon has a lot more experience in the Viking system. And he did deal with the injury last year, but again, he got 1 full year and was the 2nd corner before he got injured last year. Like, this is the guy the Vikings thought really highly of. I would have thought that they would be giving him those chances. I also don't think it's an injury recovery issue for Blackmon. Like, he's been fully cleared basically all offseason, and he tore his ACL last camp. So I'd be stunned if it were like, we're really just working him back in from injury, because as far as I know, there hasn't been any reporting that he wasn't full go kind of during the offseason process. So to me, it sounds like the Vikings really like Jeff Okudah as their 3rd cornerback, right? They think he is the leader in the clubhouse for that CB3 spot. I have major concerns about that. I didn't watch Jeff Okudah's tape initially when the Vikings signed him. I knew it was a small deal. He ended up getting like $2 million. Granted, it was fully guaranteed, but I just didn't expect him to play a major role. I thought it was like, okay, the Vikings kind of just want to see what they have in this guy, and I don't expect much from him because he's simply like been bad throughout his career. And, I didn't watch him directly, but just everything you saw from PFF grades to whatever was really not glowing about his game. So I went back and I watched Okudah's tape after seeing that he was, he was going to be a starter for the Minnesota Vikings, basically, right? Now, what did Shaq Griffin play last year? He played 572 snaps, right? That's almost exactly 50% of the snaps that the Vikings played on defense. So that is in starter territory, right? He's like going to be a top 11 snap getter on the Minnesota Vikings if he continues the same role and the Vikings continue all their snaps the same as what they did last year, right? That's a lot. And that's a lot to put on a guy who played 75 or 77, I think it was, snaps last year for the Houston Texans. So I went back and watched all 77 of those snaps, and I was not impressed. I think Okudah really struggles to process the game. Like, I think he's got solid movement skills. And I think he's got really fluid hips, and he can change direction and stick to guys really well. The problem is he gets thrown off of guys all the time. Like, he allows separation extremely consistently against not very good players because he doesn't anticipate their route breaks well, to me, right? He can often move with them when he does anticipate their route breaks, but I don't think he does a very good job of actually understanding where his opponents are going to break and mirroring that. And he ends up allowing a ton of receptions because of that. I also think he's a little bit over aggressive in press coverage. Like one of the first plays I saw, and I was really trying to be positive going into this, but it's kind of hard when the third play is Jeff Okudah allowing a 64-yard touchdown to Kevontae Turpin, right? This is the Cooper Rush-led Cowboys, Kevontae Turpin on a slant. He opens the gate way too early as Turpin tries to release against his press coverage. And granted, he won't have to play nearly as much press coverage in the Vikings defense, but there's a good example of Derek Stingley right next to him on this play where Stingley waits another beat to open his hips and actually covers the route that his opponent's running, whereas Okudah opens the gate way too early. Turpin has the ability to make an easy cut inside and just completely dust him off the line. The rest of the defense did a bad job of taking angles to actually stop Turpin from the 65-yard touchdown, but the root cause of the issue was Jeff Okudah losing immediately on the slant route and press coverage. I've seen him, whiff on a press rep, and granted it was kind of a cover 2 rep, so it was just to try to move him off the spot, but against Xavier Worthy, which he then stumbles backing out of. I've seen him get beat by River Craycraft deep on a rep, right? These guys aren't and Worthy is pretty good, but he's A, bad against press, and B, not the biggest receiver in the world. And Kevontae Turpin and River Craycraft are not anybody of note. They don't come up in probably the top 50 receivers that can pop into your head in the NFL. He's getting beat by Parker Washington on 3rd and 11 for a 30-yard gain. He's getting beat by Anthony Miller, who hadn't had a catch in the NFL since 2021. And these are, losses on out routes or comebacks where he's not able to turn. He ends up stumbling because I don't think he anticipated the route really well. There are a couple of examples of him being able to mirror guys and doing it really effectively. So I think he has the movement skills to do it. There was a play in the Cowboys game against Jonathan Mingo that comes to mind where he did a really good job of following Mingo throughout the route. Mingo tried to stem inside a little bit and then cut to the outside and then make a comeback, right? There's a couple different moves within there that you're trying to sell to the corner. I don't think he did a very good job of any of it. It's a kind of route that Justin Jefferson runs a ton, and Mingo rounded everything off. He kept his pads high. It's really an issue, route running, but Okudah was able to keep with it really well when he anticipated it, and his opponent did a bad job. Guys who are better at selling routes, I think, are going to beat Jeff Okudah consistently. And maybe that'll change in the Vikings defense, maybe with a different role and responsibility. He did play a ton of press coverage. He's probably not going to have to do as much of that, but I didn't really like the spacing in the zone coverage that he showed either. So it's kind of a double-edged sword of, I don't really like any of the coverage that I saw from Jeff Okudah. It's certainly possible that he's improved, but based on the tape that we've seen, I don't have high hopes for it. And that also means that if Mekhi Blackman's snapping beneath this guy, I really don't have high hopes for Mekhi Blackman either. I wasn't the biggest fan of Blackman's rookie year. I thought he flashed quality play. I don't think it's fair to say that he was a good cornerback in his rookie year. I thought he was good for a rookie, maybe, right? Or, somebody who had the potential to become a really good player. And, the ACL tear obviously interrupted that. He's not somebody I feel right now that I can trust the Vikings putting in a significant role on this defense. And then I also feel like, just based off of, the fact that he's snapping beneath Jeff Okudah in this defense, that's really, really concerning for me for his trajectory. So we'll see how that turns out in the cornerback room, but I would really want the Vikings to re-sign Stephon Gilmore. They signed him on, I believe, August 19th last year. Let's just run that back as we get into August, bring Stephon Gilmore back, add stability to the Vikings defensive back room with somebody who, is a bit past his prime, is definitely slower, but somebody we know can execute the coverages that he's going to be asked to do, which in a pretty complex defense for the Vikings, right? The Vikings ask these guys to do a lot of different stuff. It may not be the most difficult run with, Tyreek Hill in man coverage issues in the world, or try to run one-on-one against Jamar Chase or Justin Jefferson, are the best receivers in the NFL, but it is going to be, a lot of complex thinking that you have to do on the defensive side of the ball. And I want somebody with veteran experience and experience in that system to be able to do it. So I'm really hoping the Vikings try to bring back Stephon Gilmore. And that's not really a place you want to be, to me, in your cornerback room at the end of July here. So, it just kind of is what it is. But that brings me into the fourth question that I want to bring up, which is just, and this is something I feel a lot more positive about, but it's overall about the offensive line. Like, are we actually going to see the improvement from last year? So there's tons of stats that people will throw out in terms of just how bad Cam Robinson and Blake Brandale, honestly, and Ed Ingram and Garrett Bradbury were. And it's totally valid to look at all of those guys and what the Vikings were trotting out in the offensive line last year and think, it can't really get worse than what was happening in pass protection, particularly on the left side of the line with Cam Robinson in that Rams game. I mean, it was really, really rough. And I generally agree with that sentiment, but I think there is still an open question of how the Vikings are going to do on the offensive line, right? So Christian Darrisaw is still working his way back from injury. I think he wasn't on the PUP to start camp. He's working in with the in 11s now. I'm recording this on the 30th of July, right? So I saw reports earlier today that he was in pads in 11-on-11 situations. So that's really good to see him being back. I don't know if that means he's going to be available week 1, right? So Justin Skule might have to start. That leads to a lot of questions about Justin Skule. I didn't watch Justin Skule's tape, to be honest with you, but I kind of liked his profile as somebody who could step in and give the Vikings 5 games at the left tackle position, right, if he needed to replace Christian Darrisaw. So I feel pretty positive about that. I did an episode here on Donovan Jackson. I really like the pick. I think he's a quality pass protector at the position. I think he's an okay run blocker at the position, like an okay for an NFL offensive lineman run blocker at the position, right? He was really, really good for a college player. I think, he has room to grow in that area. Certainly any rookie, I think, would have room to grow. But, I'm positive on that. I really like the addition of Ryan Kelly at center. I like the addition of Will Fries at guard. And Brian O'Neill, I think, is a, high-level right tackle. He's not Lane Johnson, but he's a top 5, at top 10 at least, right tackle in the NFL, right? So the pieces are all together a really good offensive line. Thing is, the only players on the offensive line who have played for the Vikings before are Christian Darrisaw and Brian O'Neill. We don't have a ton of questions about Christian Darrisaw or Brian O'Neill. I think both of those guys are really good, but we replaced the entire interior. These guys, and on the positive side, Will Fries and Ryan Kelly are very familiar with each other, right? They just played a bunch of years together in Indianapolis. So, like, there is some continuity within the continuity on the offensive line, right? Even if, or there is some continuity within the new guys on the offensive line, but it still may take some time for those two to learn the Viking system, which is certainly different from what they were playing in Indianapolis. You know, it's an entirely different offensive structure, being the Shanahan-McVay schemes, as opposed to what Shane Steichen runs. Historically, you know, he's come from like the older Chargers system, I think, is initially where he was at, before going to Philadelphia under Sirianni, who I believe was a Frank Reich disciple, and kind of doing that sort of thing. So it's a pretty different offense from what they were running. And I trust both of those guys to be able to be smart and pick up the offense, but there may be a transition time over the first couple weeks as they get into it. There's almost certainly going to be some sort of transition time for Donovan Jackson being a rookie coming into the NFL. Having the veteran and having the high-level play around him is going to help, but it's still a little bit of a question mark for me to go into the season. So I think the Vikings offense is going to be good. I think on paper, it's a really, really good unit. I really like the talent that they have across the board. But let's say Donovan Jackson gets off to a little bit of a slow start and Justin School just isn't it because Christian Darrisaw is not healthy yet. The Vikings could put themselves in a hole pretty quickly by having the left side of the line struggle. You know, and I don't think they're playing extremely difficult games to start the season, right? You have the Bears, who I think are an okay team. Although, you know, with the addition of Dennis Allen, they have a pretty good secondary. They have good linebackers. They have Montez Sweat as a pass rusher, right? There's some threats there. Atlanta, I also don't think is a great team, but they have some interesting threats, right? They spent 3 first-round picks on 2 edge rushers in the draft. They've invested a ton in their defensive line talent. You know, even if I don't know if any of them are really any good, like, there's still a risk there. The Steelers traditionally have had a really dominant defensive line. They still have Cam Hayward in his ageless wonder kind of era. They have TJ Watt, who's one of the best edge rushers in the league. They have Alex Highsmith, who's a really, really good. He might be the best secondary edge rusher in the league. Now, the Vikings, I guess the Texans and the Vikings probably have a claim to that over what the Steelers have, but they have a really deep stable of edges too. On top of Highsmith, they've got a pretty deep defensive line. Obviously, they drafted Derek Harmon in the first round as well. So, like, there are some threats there. The Browns have Myles Garrett. Myles Garrett is the best edge rusher in the NFL. You know, and I think those are the first 4 weeks for the Vikings. So if, you know, the left side of the line isn't up to snuff immediately, they could dig themselves a pretty deep hole in a stretch of games. I really expect the Vikings to win. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm just saying it's kind of a question lingering in the back of my mind of whether or not these guys will all be 100% on the same page right away and all ready to hit the ground running as we enter, as we enter the season. I'm really hopeful that they are. I think it will be a really good offensive line. There's just a little bit of a voice in the back of my head telling me to be concerned about it. So I kind of wanted to bring it up here. And then the final thing I wanted to talk about for this episode is the deep depth of the team, right? So like I said earlier, this isn't necessarily the too deep, right? I feel as good as I can feel about JJ McCarthy at quarterback. I feel about as good as I can feel for a backup quarterback with Sam Howell as the backup. I don't think Sam Howell is a starting quality player, but if NFL backups were starting quality players, they'd be starters, right? And then the third quarterback doesn't really matter too much to me, whether it's Brosmer as a developmental-ish player or Brett Rippon. Like, to me, that third player is just a guy in the room to, like, add ideas and be a dude, right, in the locker room, and everybody likes him. I feel really good about the top two running backs in Aaron Jones and Jordan Mason, but I really struggle with the depth behind them. I think longtime listeners of this podcast know I don't think much of Ty Chandler's game at all. I also, don't love the profile of Trey Stewart, the rookie that they added, and I don't know much about Xavier Scott, who kind of bounced around last year. If one of Trey Stewart or Xavier Scott can impress and really just take the job for Ty Chandler, I'd be pretty excited by that. But I guess I don't have the high hopes for either of them to do that right now. So if my third running back on my roster is kind of dead weight, maybe that doesn't matter a ton, but it's something that's interesting to me, right? And it's kind of a theme as I looked across the Vikings position groups. So, it used to be the Minnesota Football Party. I think they call it the Vikings Squad Show now, which has Luke Braun on it. It's Arif Hassan, Sam Ekstrom hosts it, and then Luke Inman is on it. They did a pretty fun concept that was ranking the 90 best players on the Vikings, right? And the top 30 players, as they went through the list, they went from 90 to 1. And I really thought the top 30 players, there was a lot of interchangeability there where a guy was, ranked at 30, and I kind of felt like that was a little bit low for who they are. And then you count up the players and you realize that no, like, I'm trying to think of an example, but maybe like Jordan Mason actually does deserve to be around the 30 range, even if he's a starting quality running back. The problem I had was the players who were like 30 through 50 or 30 through 60. I really didn't have a lot of faith in it all. So I kind of want to go through position by position here. And maybe I should have put this in the intro rather than just talking about the running backs right now. But like Ty Chandler is somebody I don't really think I want on the Vikings roster, but I kind of had to project him when I did a 53-man roster projection for zone coverage onto the roster just because I didn't expect any of the other players to kind of outpace him at that position, right? And then when you look at wide receiver depth, I had a hard time kind of making a decision on the fifth wide receiver. The Vikings have, I think, three. Obviously, Justin Jefferson is incredible. Jordan Addison is a phenomenal number 2. I think Jalen Nailor is a quality number 3. They drafted Ty Felton, who, as you probably know from my episode on him, I don't love, but like I can see the vision there and he's definitely going to make the roster. That's okay. I'm fine with the stash, but I'd love to have another player to make an impact. And from the roster rankings, Tim Jones, who I think is somebody who's going to make the team, is a special teams player, right? He's going to make the team because he's a great special teams player. He's not, and maybe a good blocker as a receiver. He's not going to make an impact catching the football for the Vikings. I don't think Ty Felton's going to make a huge impact catching the football for the Vikings. So who's kind of that fourth player in the mix? It could be Rondale Moore, who reports are pretty positive of him. I think he's full go from a pretty bad knee injury that he suffered last year, like worse than the Mekhi Blackmon knee injury, right? That I kind of downplayed a little bit earlier. So he very well could be that option if he was there. Now, when I was doing the 53-man roster projection, it was before camp, before we had that information. So maybe I'm a little bit lower on the receiver room than I should be. There are also a ton of guys from last year, right? Whether that's Jay Sean Jones or Lucky Jackson, who I think is getting runs with the ones, as Justin Jefferson has missed some time with a hamstring injury that doesn't seem to be major. I should clarify, Justin Jefferson I think is totally fine with the hamstring. I don't think it'll impact his season at all. But he just needs to rest it and not aggravate an injury and make it worse. But maybe a guy like that can step up. I just don't know who it is. And maybe there will be a guy I really like in the receiver room who shows out in the preseason, kind of like Tristan Jackson did last year. And Jackson eventually made the roster before getting cut. But I really want to know who the Vikings like Brandon Powell is going to be, right? And I think there is a role to be grabbed for that player. And I don't know if any of the guys who are currently on the roster are fit for that role. So I feel better about Rondale Moore now that we're a couple days into camp than I did a week or two ago. But we'll have to see how that progresses, and if he truly is back to who he was as a player coming out of Purdue and what he was able to provide to the Cardinals in the first few years. Like I think that's definitely a very useful player for you to have on the roster. So I'm hopeful that he can reach those goals. Just going down the list of positions here, the Vikings don't have a tight end 3. right now. I was really, I really liked what I saw from Gavin Bartholomew, right, on college tape, but he's got a quote unquote significant back injury. He hasn't like participated at all in any of the Vikings offseason programs. So as a rookie, I'm certainly not comfortable putting that kind of player on the roster at all in the first place, but also, having him see a role where he plays 200-300 snaps like Johnny Munt did last year. So right now the Vikings basically only have rookies, right? They have Bryson Nesbitt and Ben Urasek as those TE3s with Giovanni Ricci, who I think is kind of a journeyman NFL player who's been on the fringe of rosters for a few years. That doesn't really inspire a ton of confidence for me at the tight end position. I really need one of those UDFAs to take the reins and show out and try to prove that they have a solid path for the Vikings at tight end 3. I feel really good about TJ Hawkins and Josh Oliver. I think they're a fantastic tight end tandem that might be the best tight end tandem in the league, right? I don't need to go through all the tight ends in my head to try to figure out if that statement is true or not. But like, depth behind that is kind of a little bit of a struggle to me. I think it's a similar story on the offensive line, right? I feel really good about the starting 5. I just kind of talked about maybe there's a lingering question in the back of my mind if they're all going to gel, but if they do, they're a fantastic unit. I think individually, if you rank those guys, they're all really, really good players. I feel pretty good about Justin Skule as that kind of swing tackle or like the backup who's a spot starter. I feel really good about Blake Brandel as a backup. I thought he was a fringe starter caliber guard last year. Like, I don't think he was great by any means, right? He had his struggles, but it wouldn't have shocked me if the Vikings kept starting him. So I'm glad to have him as a backup interior offensive lineman and also potentially have the flexibility to play tackle, right? So I really like that. When you go beyond that, though, I get really concerned. I thought Michael Juergens and Walter Rouse really, really struggled in the Vikings preseason last year. And obviously they were draft picks in the 2024 draft. But the Vikings really didn't bring in any competition for them. They brought in a guy like Logan Brown, who's a UDFA, who's ranked pretty highly, right, with some off-field or character concerns, right, football-related character concerns, I guess you would say. Reportedly, and I don't know this for a fact, right, but reportedly getting into a fight with a teammate at Wisconsin, getting kicked off the team. That's a pretty major red flag for a football player, right? So that's the question. You got guys like Joe Huber, but it's basically UDFAs the Vikings added. They didn't add a veteran who has significant playing time to this roster that they're not planning on being a starter, right? Or isn't Justin Skule. So I'm really interested to see how that depth plays out. And I'm pretty concerned if we have more than, if Darisaw is hurt and then you have a game where a couple other guys, tweak something and they have to go out for a few plays, who are the Vikings really going to be putting in those situations? And I don't think it's going to be all that good. So certainly I have a depth concern at the offensive line. The interior defensive line is one position group where I have no concern at all, basically, for the depth. You may have injury concerns at the top with Javon Hargrave and Jonathan Allen, right, who are older players who have had injury issues in the past year. But I think Harrison Phillips, Javon Hargrave, Jonathan Allen is great starting 3, right, of guys who are going to play 50 to 60% of the snaps each. I really loved Taki Taimani before he got hurt last year. I really loved Jalen Redmond when he was in last year. I thought he was a really good player, so I'm happy to hopefully have both of those guys on the roster. And then I was really excited about the potential of Levi Drake Rodriguez. Obviously, we really saw nothing from him during the regular season. He basically didn't play. But, he's another player who's pretty exciting. So I really feel good about the depth at that position. And that's a positive, right? And if you want to count Tyrion Ingram Dawkins there, he's somebody who I like the pick. In terms of edge rusher, I also feel pretty good. So that defensive line group, I feel pretty good about for the Vikings on defense. You have Van Ginkel Grenard, and then you have Dallas Turner. I feel Dallas Turner should be, hopefully, as I talked about, a really the best third edge in the league, right? That's the territory I'm hoping he's able to hit this year. And, maybe one of the better quote unquote second edge rushers in the league is kind of what I hope to see from Dallas Turner this year. somebody does need to step up, but there are names I like, right? I liked Gabriel Murphy as a prospect. I liked what we saw from Bo Richter in the preseason last year. Even if Murphy got a little bit more run during the regular season, I believe, than Richter did. And obviously Richter had special teams value as well. Tyler Batty was a pretty highly regarded undrafted free agent. Obviously, I mentioned Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins earlier, who can be more of a rundown player, maybe replace a little bit of what Patrick Jones was doing for the Vikings, and then also kind of go down inside in pass rush downs or use his additional size and quickness on the interior. If you want to try to get him after the passer that way, because he's not great as an edge rusher right now. So I really like the list of names, and I think the competition that the Vikings have between those 4 players and maybe somebody else who surprises can lead to a good depth at that position. So, I feel okay about the quarterback depth. I feel, maybe I talked myself into feeling a little bit better about the wide receiver depth, and I feel really good about the defensive line depth, but then we get to the linebacker depth, right? And let me skip cornerback. I ranted for a long time about how I think the Vikings need to bolster their cornerback depth. I think they have. Maybe I won't skip it. I think Zamiah Vaughn is interesting just based on the hype that we've seen from him. I think Dwight McGlothern is interesting from the way we've played. I don't know if I trust either player to see the field, though, at this point. So, I really don't feel great about counting on Jeff Okudah as your CB3 and counting on Mekhi Blackman as your CB4 if Mekhi Blackman can't beat out Jeff Okudah, right? So that is a huge, huge question mark for me, that position. And obviously I don't feel great about the depth if I don't feel great about the starters, right? But if I jump back to the linebacker position, I feel really good about Blake Cashman as a starter. I think he's a top 10, easily linebacker in the NFL. Honestly, like he's just such a versatile player who was such a pivotal piece of the Vikings defense last year. I think Ivan Pace is a really good starter who is a good starter who is somewhat role specific, right? Like I don't want Ivan Pace playing coverage constantly, but I think he's a quality starting player who I want to see on the football field. I think Eric Wilson can be a nice fill-in piece. I just don't have a lot of faith in Kobe King if he is actually asked to play snaps for the Vikings this year. I think he's a pretty one-dimensional player in a way that's somewhat similar to Ivan Pace, but I would say Ivan Pace is a two-dimensional player, right? He's got 2 of the 3 things you want from a linebacker really down, right? He's a great run defender and he's a great pass rusher. He's just not a high-level coverage player. Kobe King is a very strong run defender, but he's not a good pass rusher and he's not a good coverage player. So he's only got one of the 3 things you really need as a linebacker. And while Pace is missing arguably the most important thing, right? Coverage is probably an order of magnitude more important than pass rush. With the way the Vikings run their scheme, it's still fine to have him on the field. With Kobe King, he's basically only going to be good against the run. And that leaves more than half of the game, the passing situations, like where he's kind of dead weight on your defense right now. And that might be a little bit harsh, but like I just don't think that highly of him as an overall linebacker at this point in his career. And he can improve it I'm not saying he can get better. He certainly can, but I'd be scared to put him on the field year 1. And Brian Asamoah isn't even a thought right now, right? The only other linebacker you really have on your team, who has who isn't like a fill out the roster kind of guy is Brian Asamoah, and he is solidly on the 3rd team behind both Kobe King and Eric Wilson. Like he is almost certainly going to get cut, just based on what it sounds like from the initial camp reports. So like, what kind of depth do we have a linebacker behind the top 3 guys, right? And the Vikings are only ever going to use 2 linebackers at a time. They're probably going to, use 1 linebacker almost at the same rate they use 2 linebackers, right? It's not like you need to have 5 or 6 guys at the linebacker position or off-ball linebacker position like you might have, in a Mike Zimmer defense in the 2000s where you're playing base like more than 50% of the time. But you certainly need to have 4 guys who can fill in, right? Because Blake Cashman and Ivan Pace dealt with injuries last year. If both of those guys are hurt at the same time, you need to have somebody other than Eric Wilson that can step up, and I don't think the Vikings do right now. And then finally, safety is one I feel pretty good about. Now, I talked about the three safeties and how I expect the Vikings to play three safeties on 90+% of the snaps. So the Vikings don't have six safeties that I feel good about, right? If all of Theo Jackson, Josh Metellus, and Harrison Smith were to be injured at the same time. But if one of those guys gets hurt, I have decent confidence in Jay Ward's ability to step in. I like some of what I've seen in the very, very limited reps he's played. It seems like the Vikings like him as a special teamer, so I have okay confidence. And I also actually think pretty highly of Tavierre Thomas as somebody who's played as a rotational slot player. He kind of reminds me of the Justin School range of things, where he's not somebody I would want to plan to start for my team, but I feel pretty okay with him as a rotational player. So I'd expect him to make the roster and the Vikings to run with five safeties. And Tavierre Thomas is maybe a hybrid safety corner, right? He's more of a slot player, so he might fill in more for that Josh Metellus role. The Vikings really don't have safeties beyond those two guys. So, if we see multiple injuries at the position, they'll probably have to adjust the way they play defense to run, instead of nickel with three safeties, run nickel with three corners a lot more often, and maybe don't run as much dime as they typically do, or run dime with four corners, right? Which is I would say more standard for teams than three safeties and three corners even in dime. But but at the end of the day, you can only have so many safeties on your roster, right? And having five safeties, I would feel like having two backup safeties who I feel okay about putting in the field is pretty good in terms of a status for a defensive back room, right? So I definitely think there is a depth issue on the Vikings. It doesn't apply to all the positions, right? I feel pretty good about safety. I feel pretty good along the defensive line. And that's 8 of the 11 positions roughly on the Vikings defense, maybe 8 of 12 if you want to count some of the splits, or 8 of 13 if you want to count how the Vikings split up their rotations. But I'm really concerned about the depth of linebacker and corner, and I'm really concerned about the depth over the course of the entire offense. Really, the wide receiver depth behind Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison and Jalen Nailor. I don't know if you're going to have a third guy who can step up and produce consistently, and I don't even know if Jalen Nailor can produce consistently. When Jordan Addison gets suspended, that sort of thing. With Jordan Addison out, unless it's Rondale Moore and he kind of continues his trajectory and outplays my initial expectations, I don't know who's going to be your third wide receiver for the Vikings, right? They might just play a ton of 12 with Josh Oliver and TJ Hawkinson. But then if one of Josh Oliver or TJ Hawkinson misses time, I have no idea who's going to play at tight end. And the offensive line, I think the bottom of the roster guys are going to be really weak when you compare them to the rest of the league. So definitely concerns with the depth, and I think it's kind of an indication of some of the struggles that the Vikings have had drafting over the last couple of years, that I feel like that low-level depth is pretty weak on the team, right? If you look at Kwesi's drafts, the only players who I would expect this year to play 300-plus snaps, who he's drafted are, well, I guess, the last 2 years of guys notwithstanding, right? Because we haven't seen anything really major from Dallas Turner or JJ McCarthy in the NFL, right? And those guys make or break Kwesi's tenure as GM for the Vikings, right? If they're good, basically nothing else matters. If they're both bad, it's really catastrophic for what he's done. But you look at the 2022 and the 2023 draft class, the only players who have made an impact, who I expect to play over 300 snaps this year, are Jordan Addison and Jalen Nailor. You can add Ivan Pace into that, but that's still 3 players over 2 draft class, 15 to 20 total draft picks. Let me pull up the exact number here. 16 total draft picks from the Vikings over the course of those 2 years, and 3 impact players, if you count Pace as an undrafted free agent coming in, which I think it's fair to do, right? Kwesi's had a ton of wins in undrafted free agency of depth players, but not a lot of guys that are making impacts. So, that kind of, and a lot of the guys that I named, right, over the course of that process aren't players who were draft picks from those couple of years. So there's really a couple of missing classes to fill out the depth of the Vikings roster. And I do think that's negatively impacting them in some way, even if it doesn't hurt their overall overall starting lineup, right? And that's not to say that, Kwesi has done a terrible job as GM or anything like that. I think he's done quite a good job as GM. And I think the strength of the roster that you go through and look at the starters is a strong example of that. But I do think that, he's drafted poorly generally. And I think that narrative will need to change if the Vikings want to be successful. Part of that narrative changing can be the 2024 draft, right? Where you had 2 extremely high investments in players who have yet to hit for the Vikings. Turner, because he was stuck behind 2 elite players at their position, and McCarthy because he was injured last year, and that could change this year. And I'm really excited about those 2 players. I mean, I carved out a lot of time for both of them in this show specifically, but we need to see it. So I'm hopeful that we will for the Vikings. That's going to wrap it up for me for this episode of Kindred Skulls. You can find me at Matt Freese at Fries Football on BlueSky. You can find my co-host Nick Olson at Nick Olson NFL on Twitter. We are at Kindred Skulls on BlueSky and Twitter. We're available on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Also available on YouTube. And with that, Skull Vikings.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.